Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and last time I animated the battle for Lookout Mountain, and now William T. Sherman attacks the Confederate right on the north end of Missionary Ridge at Tunnel Hill. During the night of November 24th, the defeated Confederate forces that sat atop Lookout Mountain made their way down the Summertown Road into Chattanooga Valley and across Chattanooga Creek. A lunar eclipse shielded their movement from Union soldiers' eyes, but the darkness made the trip off the mountain more treacherous. One soldier described the scene. As quietly as possible, but with stiffened limbs, they went stumbling and falling and rolling down those rough declines, cold and chilled to the bone. Getting into column as best they could, they passed across the valley in Chattanooga Creek. The men, wet and cold, and tired and hungry, were disheartened, and incapacity had turned victories into defeats. It was expected that similar lines would be followed, and they were not in good humor. The moon went into an eclipse and shrouded everything in almost total darkness, which to many was an omen of evil. It was a sad moment for the troops and an enraging one for their army commander Braxton Bragg. Bragg was astonished that Carter Stevenson, who commanded the mountain, couldn't hold such an impregnable location. At a council of war, Bragg, William Hardee, and John C. Breckinridge met to discuss what to do next. Their forces were pulling back to Missionary Ridge, the last defensive location still under their control around Chattanooga. Hardee suggested that the army pull back to Chickamauga Station and maybe even further into Georgia in order to find a defensive position that gave them a better advantage. Breckinridge recoiled at such a suggestion. He argued that Missionary Ridge was a great defensive location, and that if the soldiers couldn't fight there, they couldn't fight anywhere. Bragg sided with Breckinridge, but agreed with Hardee that Sherman would renew his attack against the northern end of Missionary Ridge, and for Hardee to reinforce that area. On the north end of the ridge, Patrick Cleburne, who skirmished with Sherman that evening, grew restless, wanting to know what was to happen the next day, so he sent an aide to find Hardee. The aide found the corps commander, and Hardee stated, "Tell Cleburne we are to fight, that his division will undoubtedly be heavily attacked, and that he must do his very best." Cleburne and his division had become one of the most dependable units in the Confederacy, and Hardee had faith in the Irishman. Not all soldiers were confident. A member of Cleburne's division wrote, "Their minds were filled with doubt and their hearts burdened with misgivings. They had seen nothing but blunders and defeats, and expected nothing else today. They knew they would fight only with the strength left from the shipwreck of their hopes, that they were standing on the embers of their ruined edifice, and with this knowledge the eclipse produced an effect that was unaccountable were it not for the gloom that paralyzed their hope." They discussed the situation, the loss of Lookout Mountain, the foothold the enemy had obtained on our right, of Hooker to follow from Lookout Mountain and envelop our left, and no force to stop him, of the opportunity thrown away to capture Chattanooga and destroy the Federal Army, and the infatuation that determined a general engagement with the risk of ruin to the army. They were in a poor state of mind to loan any confidence to General Bragg. He had expressed a want of confidence in the army, and they returned the want of it in him with interest. Ulysses S. Grant, commanding all Union forces in and around Chattanooga, hoped that William T. Sherman's dawn attack on the 25th of November would roll up the flank of Bragg's army. On Lookout Mountain, soldiers under Joseph Hooker's command planted a United States flag on the summit, signaling to all that Lookout Mountain was entirely in Federal hands. George Thomas ordered Hooker to move toward Rossville Gap in preparation to hit the left flank of the Confederates on Missionary Ridge. Grant wanted Thomas to ascend Missionary Ridge from the east when Sherman turned the Confederate flank, but the hours were passing by and Sherman wasn't moving. Aside from a few sporadic volleys, Sherman hadn't fully engaged the Confederates at Tunnel Hill. Sherman decided to attack with only 2 brigades from Hugh Ewing's division, putting the rest of his men in a supporting role. A much larger attack could have been made. He had over 16,000 men. At dawn, he approached Ewing, his brother-in-law, and said, "I guess, Ewing, if you're ready, you might as well go ahead." He puffed on his cigar and then added, "Keep up formation till you get to the foot of the hill." Ewing then asked, "And shall we keep it after that?" Sherman responded, "If you like, if you can, but don't call for help until you actually need it." Corse's brigade would attack the Confederates at Tunnel Hill, and Loomis's brigade would approach the hill from the northwest. That morning, Ewing told Loomis not to bring on a general engagement. The morning was passing away, and those precious hours that Sherman waited allowed Cleburne to reinforce his position. It was a much stronger line than the night before. Now, at nearly 8 a.m., Sherman rode over to the left of his line and ordered Joseph Lightburn to dispatch 200 men to support Corse's left flank. Lightburn chose the 30th Ohio and part of the 4th West Virginia for this task. The Ohioans and West Virginians stepped off toward the Confederate position, unaware that Corse's brigade hadn't begun their assault. They came into contact with skirmishers from the 24th Texas. The exchange of volleys from the two sides convinced the Texans that they needed to fall back, but as they did, the commander of the Ohioans ordered an advance, so the Texans performed a fight and withdrawal. Stopping to catch their breath, the 30th Ohio could see the rebel artillery perched on the top of the rise in front of them. Eager to capture the artillery, they dashed up the ridge. Once they got within range, the cannons fired canister into their ranks, dismantling the unit. They fell back to a safe position with their commander, Colonel Theodore Jones, irate that Corse was nowhere to be found. Jones sent word back to Lightburn that he needed support. He sent the 37th Ohio to Jones's left, but at the same time, Corse's regiments began to file to Jones's right. The 40th Illinois attacked the Confederate position, but they received no support, either from Jones or from their own brigade. As they fell back, the 46th Ohio, along with Corse himself, came up. At first, he expressed confidence that an attack with his and the 30th and the 37th Ohio on his left, they could break the Confederate line. However, he quickly changed his mind and asked Jones to report back to Sherman and ask what they should do next. When Jones reported to Sherman, Sherman snapped back, "Go back and make that charge immediately. Time is everything. If you want more men, I will give you that. General Grant is on Orchard Knob, waiting for your assault in order to send up a column from the Army of the Cumberland." While Sherman grew angry and lashed out at Jones, Cleburne received reinforcements. Lewis's Orphan Brigade and parts of Brown and Cummings' brigade filed on to Cleburne's left. The buildup of troops in that sector reflected Bragg's concern over his right flank. Hardee and Bragg both left Cleburne to manage the area, having great faith in the Irishman. Following Sherman's orders, Corse, with Lightburn's regiments on his left, charged the rebel position. The undulating terrain tired the Federals, but they got to within 50 feet of the earthworks before a combination of musketry and canister drove the Federals back, with the Texans chasing after them. As the 40th Illinois and the 46th Ohio hunkered down in a ravine, they stopped the Texans in their tracks, wounding Brigadier General James A. Smith of Cleburne's brigade of Texans. Cleburne would replace Smith with Hiram Granberry, and the Texans returned to their breastworks. Corse, now becoming agitated, ordered the 103rd Illinois and the 6th Iowa to charge the rebel works. They made it into the rebel lines where hand-to-hand fighting broke out. All of the officers in Sweat's batteries supporting the Texans were gunned down. Cleburne sent the 2nd and 5th Kentucky from Lewis's brigade to dislodge the Federals from his right flank. It was now past 11:30 a.m., and Corse's brigade and part of Lightburn's brigade had fought for over 3 hours and hadn't dislodged Cleburne's men. Corse and his men would fall back, with Corse being wounded in the attack. Command of the brigade would go to Charles Walcutt. Walcutt asked Sherman for reinforcements, but Sherman was done with the northern approach to Missionary Ridge, thinking it useless to attempt another assault, so he ordered Walcutt to hold his position. It was noon and Sherman would try another approach. Loomis's brigade hadn't made it any further than the railroad embankment by this point. The long-range fire from the Confederates on top of Tunnel Hill and the rebel skirmishers at the bottom held them in place. Loomis had been given permission to call upon Bushbeck if he needed additional help. When he asked for reinforcements, Bushbeck sent the 27th and 73rd Pennsylvania regiments to Loomis's left and helped to drive back the rebel skirmishers. At this point, Colonel Joseph Taft, who commanded the two regiments, ordered a halt, but the 27th continued on up the hill, clawing their way to the top. Within 30 yards of the Confederate position, they stopped and began to fire on the rebels. They drove some of the artillery away. The Confederate infantry would have to expose their heads too much to return fire, so they started to lob rocks down the hill, striking many Federal soldiers, wounding them. Cleburne's line was growing even stronger as the 34th Georgia and more artillery batteries occupied the hills and knolls on the north end of Missionary Ridge. Loomis grew even more anxious about the precariousness of his line and went to his superiors asking for help. Brigadier General Charles Matthews and his brigade stood behind Loomis, ready for action, but wouldn't take orders from Loomis. Loomis then went to his division commander, Ewing, and Ewing told him to order Matthews forward under his orders. Loomis did as he was told, and Matthews' men advanced across the fields leading to Tunnel Hill. Confederate artillery watched their every move and lobbed shells at them the entire distance. When they made it to the elevated terrain, they halted, being partly protected from the artillery fire and musketry at their current location. A member of Matthews' brigade recalled the assault. In front of us was a rail fence, and, being in direct line of fire, its splinters and fragments flew in every direction. "Jump the fence, men! Tear it down!" cried the colonel. Never did men get over a fence more quickly. Our distance was nearly half a mile to the rebel position. We started on a charge, running across the open fields. I had heard the roaring of heavy battle before, but never such a shrieking of cannonballs and bursting shells as met us on that charge. We could see the enemy working their guns, while in plain view other batteries galloped up unlimbered and let loose at us. Behind us our own batteries were firing at the enemy over our heads, till the storm and roar became horrible. It sounded as if the end of the world had come. Halfway over we had to leap a ditch, perhaps 6 feet wide and nearly as many deep. Some of our regiment fell into this ditch and could not get out. A few tumbled in intentionally and stayed there. I saw this and ran back and ordered them to get out, called them cowards, threatened them with my revolver. They did not move. Again I hurried on with the line. All the officers were screaming at the top of their voices. I too screamed, trying to make the men hear. "Steady, bear to the right, keep in line, don't fire, don't fire," was yelled till all were hoarse, until the awful thunder of the cannon made all commands unheard and useless. The remains of 2 Union brigades, Matthews and Bushbeck, clung to the side of the ridge. To venture back across the fields meant sure destruction. But most of Bushbeck's men had ran out of ammunition. The commander of the 73rd Pennsylvania sent runners to the rear 3 times for more ammunition, but none returned. Colonel Taft, who had led the regiment, decided to go back himself to get ammunition, but as soon as he stood up, he was cut down by a rebel bullet. It was much safer to stay. The 27th Pennsylvania asked for help from Matthews, who sent the 26th Missouri and the 93rd Illinois up the hill to support them. At the same time, Cleburne had sent the 2nd and 15th Arkansas consolidated to counter the Union advance. Sherman, Ewing, and others now were becoming greatly concerned over the situation, and Grant on Orchard Knob was growing tired of Sherman's lack of success. Colonel Greenberry Rom was ordered to the right of the Union line. The disposition of his troops would be up to him. The rebel artillery overshot his columns of men as they marched to the aid of their fellow blue soldiers. At the base of Tunnel Hill, Rom put the 80th Ohio on the left and the 17th Iowa on the right, with the 10th Missouri and the 56th Illinois held in reserve. Then the front line was moved up the hill to support Matthews. Most of Cleburne's men, especially the Texans, were out of ammunition, and something had to be done about the 2 new Union regiments approaching the rebel breastworks if Cleburne's line was to hold. More regiments came to Cleburne's aid, the 36th and 56th Georgia, as well as the 1st and 27th Tennessee Consolidated Regiment. Cleburne and many of the Confederate officers began to wager that a strong counterattack down the hill would stop the Federal assaults. The Georgians, Tennesseans, and Texans charged off the hill, rounding up countless amounts of prisoners. As they charged down the hill, Rom's reserve line still remained at the base. The 2 sides threw about 4 or 5 volleys into one another, and then the Confederate regiments slowly made their way back up Tunnel Hill. The Union brigades would be pulled back to safety, and Sherman's attempt to outflank Bragg on Missionary Ridge had failed, stopped by Cleburne's men.